the beginnings of biomechanics, reasons to study it, some of the basic terms, and we spent just a little bit of time looking at kinematics, which is just describing movement. Things like distance, speed, velocity, acceleration, and we learned how to calculate those things, differences between them, which is that stuff. And then we started looking at kinetics, which has everything to do with the forces, and that's everything we've talked about since then and will talk about today has everything to do with forces. Looked at characteristics of forces, Newton's laws. Hopefully this was a review for you. If not, it's going to be a little bit harder, but particularly looking at some of these things. And we looked at this impulse-momentum relationship, which has everything to do with the last law, the law of action-reaction. For everything, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Because when we looked at this formula, if you change something on one side of the formula, something else has to change over here. And that helped us to do things like decrease impact when you have a collision, because that then can decrease the force. And we looked at that sort of thing. And we did the egg drop thing, and now we're up to gravity. So, everybody knows what gravity is. We have it with us all the time. External force. It's created as the attractive pull between two objects. Okay? And with the pull, it's affected by two things: the mass of the object as well as the distance between them. So the bigger an object is, the greater the pull of gravity toward the Earth. The further away an object is from the Earth, the less gravitational pull there is. For us, the amount of our gravitational pull is our weight. Now, weight and mass are not the same, but for our purposes, that's what we will think of it as. Gravity is what causes a ball, when you toss it into the air, to come back to you instead of flying off into space somewhere. It allows us to play ball sports. You hit that golf ball, you know it's coming down somewhere. Hopefully where you want it to come down. Gravity is what we're trying to overcome in a lot of sports. When you're jumping, when you're hitting, when you're kicking, you are trying to overcome gravity of some kind. Now, your center of gravity center of mass is the point at which your weight is distributed equally. Symmetrical means equally. When you are standing, like I am here, like our person there is, little drawing there, your center of gravity is pretty much right here. In other words, if my center of gravity is here, you take half of my mass, it's going to be above that point. If you take half of it, it's going to be below that point. If you cut me in half this way, half of it over here, half of it over there. What is more difficult is what happens when I start to lean one way. Where is my center of gravity going? It's going this direction, because no longer can you find the midpoint right here? It's not right here anymore. It's shifted over this direction. Okay. Center of mass is what we're overcoming when we are trying to move. Okay? If you keep your center of gravity right in the middle, you can move easily. If you have it out here, what happens is that you start to fall. If you take a look at this diagram here, there's the center of mass or gravity. If you start to turn, well, if I were to start to move forward like this, like my green arrow, I'm moving forward. My center of gravity is moving forward, so in order to keep balance, there has to be an equal and opposite reaction. Look at this. Something else has to happen. So in order for me to not to fall, I need to now do something, like lift my leg up, that then makes my distribution of mass more equal again. Okay. This was one thing I like about this section of things we're talking about in biomechanics, and that's one of the reasons why I chose to use these chapters instead of the ones in your book. Number one, because the ones in your book are totally beyond what, even after you take your beginning biomechanics class, you'll understand. But secondly, it's very practical. And you can start to understand principles in terms of practicality. And one way that has been used in sport, one activity, sporting event, in which center of gravity takes center stage, that's the high jump in track and field. And probably 60 years ago, the main method of doing how many of you have seen the high jump? You know what I'm talking about. Okay. Well, you know it in one way. 60 years ago, it looked totally different how the athletes were doing it. And in fact, when I was in high school or junior high and just moving into high school, it was starting to make that transition back down to our level. The gal, the high school gal that was from my high school, she won the high jump when she was a senior. She was using this method, the straddle method. And this is what it looks like. I wanted you to see this so you know how to compare it to the one you've always seen. So here is the straddle method. So the jumper takes off, and they're trying to essentially get their whole center of mass over the bar. And here we see it in slow motion. Notice how it's an older jumper because none of you younger jumpers know even what it looks like, much less try to do it. So leading with the arm and the leg, and you roll over it. Might have been called the Western roll or something like that at one point. Okay, so that is the straddle method. Now, in this next clip I want to show you is the clip of, right now it's called the Fosbury flop. You all know it as the flop method. And Dick Fosbury was actually named after a person. He was a jumper who first started using it. He started using it back in the 60s, and this is mostly a clip of him at the 1968 Olympics, so 50 years ago, and how people had never seen this method before. Everybody else was doing the straddle.
The 1968 Olympic Games proved to be a turning point in the history of the high jump event. Into the Mexico City Olympic arena came not only a new name to the sport, but a new approach, which was to revolutionize the high jump event. Dick Fosbury from the United States demonstrated a new style of high jump, which some considered strange and awkward. It was a jump he had devised in the previous years, and one which unsettled his opponents. While the crowd at first saw him as a novelty, his continued success at clearing the ever-increasing height soon made it apparent he was a serious contender. Valentin Gavrilov from the Soviet Union failed at his attempt of 2.22 meters, while Fosbury and his US teammate Edward Carruthers cleared their way to a jump-off. The bar sat at 2.24. Carruthers failed, and Fosbury took his new style of high jump over the bar and into the history books. Fosbury had won his gold. Within a few years, the Fosbury flop had become the standard method of jumping in this great Olympic sport.
Okay, so yeah, by the 1968 that was the 68 Olympics. By 1972, virtually all of the jumpers were now using the flop. Why? Is because it has to do with center of gravity. And let me find my other video. Here it is. This video, this clip here, will show us what happens to the center of gravity, comparing the straddle method to the flop method, and why the flop method is so much more effective than the straddle method. It has everything to do with center of gravity, center of mass. And first we watch a little commercial. Hopefully with sound. Oh, don't tell me I'm not going to have sound. Oh, here we go. Well, that's not good. Oh, there you go. Sorry. Thank you.
Dick Fosbury
Yeah.
tried his hand at home.
Thanks.
In the early 1960s, Dick Fosbury tried his hand at almost every sport, but never excelled at anything until, at the age of 16, he turned to the high jump. But when he couldn't compete against the strong athletes at his college, using the standard high jump techniques of the time, Fosbury tried to jump a different way, backwards. Instead of jumping with his face towards the bar, bringing each leg over in the traditional straddle method, he jumped with his back towards the bar. Fosbury improved his record by over half a foot and left his coaches amazed by this strange new style of high jumping. During the next few years, Fosbury perfected his high jump style, won the U.S. national trials, and assured his place in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico. In the Olympic Games, Fosbury amazed the world with his new technique, winning a gold medal with an Olympic record leap of 2.24 meters. By the next Olympic Games, almost all competing high jumpers had adopted what came to be known as the Fosbury flop. What's the secret behind the technique? It lies in a physics concept called the center of mass. For every object, we can locate the average position of all of its mass by taking into account how the mass is spread around the object. For instance, the center of mass of a flat rectangular object of uniform density will be in the intersection of both diagonals, in equal distance from each corner. We can find the center of mass for other objects by similar calculations, or by finding the object's balancing point, which lies right underneath its center of mass. Try balancing a broom by holding it and slowly bringing your hands together until they meet. This balancing point lies right underneath the broom's center of mass. We humans also have a center of mass. When most people stand up, their center of mass is around the belly. But what happens to your center of mass when you lift your hands in the air? Your center of mass moves upwards. It moves all the time as you move through the day, based on how your body is positioned. It can even move outside of your body. When you bend forward, your center of mass is located below your bent belly,
That's
in a place
important.
where there is no mass at all. Weird to think about, but that's the average position of all your mass. Many objects' center of mass are outside their bodies. Think of donuts or boomerangs. Now look at the Fosbury flop and follow the position of the center of mass of the jumper. The jumper runs very fast, so he can divert his horizontal velocity to vertical velocity, and jumps. Wait for it. There. Look at the jumper's center of mass as his body bends backward. It's below the bar. That is the secret behind the jump. With the old pre-Fosbury techniques, the jumper had to apply enough force to lift his center of mass above the bar by a few inches in order to clear it. The Fosbury flopper doesn't have to do that. The genius of the Fosbury flop is that the jumper can apply the same amount of force but raise his body much higher than before. That means he can raise the bar so high that even when his center of mass can't go any higher, his arcing body can. Fosbury's technique brought the high jump to new heights by splitting the jumper's body away from his center of mass, giving it that much more room to clear higher and higher bars. So the Fosbury flop may be sports history's only great leap forward, that is also a great leap backward.
So did everybody see how with the center of mass with the straddle, it has to be above the bar, but when you're using the flop, it's below the bar. And then actually just arcing your back even more helps to get yourself higher over the bar, which is really cool. That is a very nice practical application of center of mass in sport. Okay, so gravity is a force between two objects, and the objects don't necessarily have to be touching. Okay, we just saw the Fosbury flop. Person is in the air, they're not touching the ground, but there's still gravitational pull. A ball thrown in the air, there's nothing touching it when it's in the air, but there's still gravitational pull. Now we're going to look at contact force when two objects are touching each other. Okay, remember, force is a push or a pull exerted on an object. And so this has to do when they're touching each other. There's something that exists that is called ground reaction force. Now, think about gravity. Gravity is a force that's pulling us toward the earth. If you really think about it, if gravity is pulling us toward the earth, all of us should be face down flat on the earth, and we wouldn't be able to stand. If the only force acting on us is a force pulling us toward the earth, there's no way we'd be able to stand up, much less move around. But luckily, that's not the only force acting on us. We have this contact force acting on us. That is a force that exerted on the performer by the ground. So I'm standing here, gravity is pulling me down. Meanwhile, contact force, ground reaction force, is pushing up on me. Okay? It affects us and allows us to do motion. It affects us up and down, help us go forward, backward, side to side, as long as we're manipulating our bodily levers to do so. Okay. Actually, everybody stand up. Where we are. Okay. As you're standing here, stretch, whatever. As you're standing, you should be able to feel pressure on the bottom of your feet. Okay? That pressure is your ground reaction force pushing up on you. Okay? As well as gravity pushing down on you. Okay? So you can feel that. All right, you go ahead and have a seat. That is part of what helps you with ground, helps you stand, lets you know you're standing, and helps us manipulate movement. So let's look at some ground reaction force. The easiest to understand is vertical ground reaction force. Now we can see that particularly with a vertical jump. Just standing here and jumping in. I try to jump high into the air. What happens with that? One of the things that a lot of biomechanists use in their research is a force plate. And obviously force, that has everything to do with kinetics. Dr. Reedike does a lot with force plates in her research. And these are some of the graphs they would get using a force plate. The top one is what happens, what does the vertical ground reaction force look like when you are doing just a straight vertical jump up. Okay. Just standing here, right here in a position, before I start my motion of trying to jump, right over here, we see one body weight. Okay, so right now, my vertical ground reaction force pushing up on me is one of my body weights. When I start to dip down, I start to do my crouch, moving my arms. This is called a loading phase. It's part of the takeoff phase. And what you see happening there is that it slightly goes below one body weight. You decrease your body weight a little bit here as far as ground reaction force goes. This is the loading phase. Now, when you start to push upward, that's when you start to see the vertical ground reaction force increasing. It goes up past 2 times your body weight. Up to here. Now here, at the very top, is when you've pushed the hardest and now your toes are starting to come off. They're coming off the ground, and now is where you start to see the decrease until right down here. What do you think's happened? You're off the ground. You bet. There's no vertical ground reaction force at all because you're up in the air. Remember here, your toes are still on the ground. You're not up in the air yet here. Your toes are still coming off the ground, but you're decreasing in that force because they're starting to come off. They're starting this part of taking off. And then finally they're up in the air. That's when you don't see anything happening. Right down here, what happens here? That's the landing. Okay, so now you're coming down and you see a huge increase here. When you're jumping, that landing part is where you're taking all the brunt of your body weight, and in fact it goes up just about to 3 times your body weight as you land. Okay, that's vertical ground reaction force. Now, on a long jump, let's say it's a standing long jump, you're needing to go both up and forward. So now you have vertical ground reaction force and horizontal ground reaction force. So now, instead of just trying to jump high up in the air, I'm trying to jump forward. Okay, so now they have force plates and they can measure both vertical, which looks a lot like what we just saw up here, and horizontal ground reaction force, the pushing forward. So now down here we had your vertical ground reaction force. That's because gravity's working down on us here. There's always at least one of your body weight pushing down on you when you're standing. Down here, because it's trying to move forward, gravity isn't pushing you from here. So that's why it is 0 to start with. When you start to take and do your crouch down here, now you start to see an increase in your vertical ground reaction force. You're starting to get yourself to move forward. The force plate can feel your feet starting to push you forward. And that's why you see this here. Until now, right here, just like right here, your toes are starting to come off the ground. Right there, same part right there, your toes are starting to come off the ground. Right there, you're up in the air. Now when you're starting to land, it actually goes below 0, kind of to a negative body weight. And why that is because now you're starting to stop you from going forward. So it's negative. And that's why you see it falling below the 0 point here. And then it levels out to 0 as you gather yourself and you're ready to go. Okay. With running, or walking, but this is running, you have both vertical and horizontal ground reaction forces. So, vertically, it looks like this is your, right here, this is the contact point. So now, in a step, and we're going to watch a video in a second, but when you're running or walking, as soon as your foot starts to touch the ground, that's what we're seeing right there. That's the contact point. And you see here when you're starting to touch the ground, you need a push so that you can get up in the air. And we start to see that. Here's where your toes, you're coming through, mostly on the foot here. And now when you're starting to push off on your toes, that's where you see this decline here, just like in the vertical jump. When you start to come off on those toes, that's less force, so it starts to decline. This is when this foot is in the air now. Down here, just like when you land in the long jump, when you are running and your foot first contacts the ground, it's essentially trying to stop you. It's like a brake. And so that's why it goes below zero body weight, goes negative, and then when you start to put full contact on the foot and start to push off to make you go forward, that's when you start to see an increase in the horizontal ground reaction force. And again here, now that foot's up in the air again. And this is a very, very quick video. I'll play it a few times, but this is what it looks like, and you'll actually see the top graph. What you're only going to see on the graph is the vertical ground reaction force. So this top chart, we're going to see that in action now. So there's the heel contact. You see that happening? There it goes down. And now heel contact there. Starts to come up. And one more time. Heel contact. See the red arrow, red circle going up and down? Up in the air. Here's the other foot. Heel contact. Again, that's only showing vertical ground reaction force. One more time. Here comes the circle, red circle comes up, there's contact. It's up in the air, now the other foot, contact. Isn't that cool? So that is vertical ground reaction force in action. Now, if we just look at this, keep this in mind for future things we're going to talk about today. Vertical ground reaction force with running is 2, that's just above 2, can be 2 to 3 times your body weight. So you've got a lot of force being placed on your joint in running. Which leads us to this, shock attenuation. What do we mean by attenuation?
Like the control of it, how do you control it?
Exactly, we're trying to control it. So if I were running barefoot, and I know they have the barefoot socks or whatever you can wear now with running. I've not looked into what kind of research is done on those. But the idea behind wearing shoes at all, but especially running shoes, basketball shoes, part of the reason is to help with shock attenuation, to try to control, minimize that force that's being placed on your joints. Because if you just putting 3 times, let's just say, body weight on your knees and your hips every time you take a step in running, that's a lot of force. And over time, it can cause a lot of damage. So that's why running shoes were invented. And these were my very, 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 very first running shoes, way back when. You know, when I first started on the track team and was told, my older brothers who were running said, you need to get some running shoes instead of those little sneakers you were running around in. Okay, so I got these. Leather, they were very uncomfortable. They're way too big because they're men's shoes. I mean, I wore like 2 pairs of socks with them, which is not good. And laced them up as tight as we can go. But at least they were an attempt. They were the start to trying to attenuate the shock involved in running. What did you learn about shoes and how to take care of that shock? What kind of midsole is best? A harder one. Okay, now think back to what we've just learned on Tuesday. We did the egg drop activity. You could vary 3 variables. You could vary the size of the egg, which was mass. You could vary the height from which it was dropped, which affected the speed, the velocity. Or you could vary what it landed on. So essentially, we're varying what our feet land on here. That's what we're varying. According to that little thing we did, the best thing to land on was what? The softest thing. Okay? Well, that's not carrying through here. What you see here, over here, whoops, wrong way. Over here, these are our softest midsoles for our shoes, but it's actually still having a lot of impact force. It's having more impact on your feet than a mid-level sole, hardness sole. What was the explanation for that? Yes?
The softer one compressed more so your foot contacted the ground.
Okay, so in this case, maybe it's because of the weight of the body, you know, an egg versus a body weight, I'm not sure why, but in this case, if your shoe is too soft, if the midsole of your shoe is too soft, so if we were to make running shoes with this level of softness or hardness in the midsole, it's not going to protect us as well as kind of a mid-level hardness, because if it's too soft, then you have too much compression on it. It becomes like running on the ground, essentially, because there's no protection there. If it becomes a little bit harder, then you keep that softness from hitting the ground, in a sense. Okay? So this is looking at our vertical and horizontal ground reaction forces, how we can minimize it by looking at some of the variables that we looked at the other day. Okay? Which I thought was actually pretty fascinating. So running shoes now, unlike my old Adidas Country, now they have these nice gel midsoles, all different kinds of different experimental things that they're looking at to try to make running shoes lighter but still more protective, but not too soft, not too hard, not too soft. And now they even got specialties if you're running longer distances, shorter distances, if you're a heavier runner versus a lighter runner, all these different kinds of things. And that's good. I mean, we do research on running shoes. That's why we get better running shoes. And that's biomechanical research right there. All right. Well, that leads us to another kind of contact force, and that is friction. And friction is simply the force that opposes sliding between 2 objects. Other words for it are grip or traction. Friction force works in opposition to propelling force. Here we have a propelling force, which is a step a friction force right there. When propelling force and friction force are equal, there's no slipping. When propelling force and friction force are equal, there's no slipping. So, just yesterday, my husband and I got new carpet in our bedroom. And in order to do that, you got to move all the furniture out of your bedroom. And so we got to have some pretty heavy furniture, of course, with all clothes and stuff. And so we had to move dressers. So here's this massive dresser, and here I am pushing on the dresser, and it's not moving. The friction force is equal to the propelling force. But that's not what we wanted. We're not going to lift them, we're going to push them, because lifting would be too hard. We wanted them to move. So in order to do that, we changed something. We found these little sliders, put them under the legs of the dresser. Lo and behold, now the propelling force, which was just me at this point, now me alone, I could move this big dresser just by pushing on it, a little higher, but you get the idea. And now the propelling force was greater than the friction force. Okay? And when we're looking at things in sport and physical activity, there is a limit to the friction force. Okay? In this case, with my dresser, there was no more friction that could go under that, and we changed something, and my propelling force ended up being greater. Now, think about sports and physical activities. What are some cases, and you might think back to your book, what are some things in sport, situations in sport, where you don't want any slipping? You want the propelling force to be equal to the friction force. Yes?
Going off the blocks is like
Okay, so going off the blocks, maybe a swimming race, maybe a track race, you don't want there to be slipping. Okay, so that's a point where we want friction force and propelling force to be equal. Okay, good. What else? Think practically. Think of places where you don't want slipping to happen.
When you're catching something.
Yeah, catching something. Okay, so in that case, you don't want the ball or whatever to go through your hands. Okay, what are some other cases where you're holding things and you don't want slipping? Yeah.
you're holding like a baseball or a golf club and you swing it, you don't want the golf club or the baseball bat to go flying.
Exactly. So you got your golf club, you've got your bat, you have your tennis racket, you have your weights. We put powder on our hands to help with our weights. We wear weightlifting gloves. That does other things too, but that helps with that. We wear batting gloves. Okay, golfers wear gloves on their hands. You tennis players will put a particular type of grip. What do they call that? Something on their racket. A tape and stuff. I don't know what you call that. Watching the U.S. Open the other day. Oh, shoot, I forgot his name. Was it Anderson? Was one of the players? The guy who lost. He was right. I mean, like a minute before they started the match, he's restringing his grip on his racket. He does that all the time, and that's what he was trying to help with. Okay. What are some cases where you want to increase slipping? So you want less friction. Yes.
Ice
Ice skating, exactly. That's a good one. What else? Skiing.
Bowling,
Ooh, when?
like when you're putting the ball down the lane.
Putting the ball down the lane? Yeah, definitely. And in fact, I don't know if this is what you're talking about, but with good bowlers, there's a little bit of slide when they release the ball. And in fact, I used to do quite a bit of bowling and have a slide, and those times where I kind of stick, it's like, ugh, I don't get the same kind of release I want. Okay, what else? Other times you want slipping. Yes? Ooh, yes, diving and volleyball. You don't want to just slap right into the ground. You want to be able to slide a little bit. What else? Say again. Good, good. So you need a little bit slipping then. What else? Yes? Like when? Okay, good, good. So you guys got some good ideas about when you want a little bit of friction, more friction in sports and physical activities, or when you don't. Okay, and it could vary on the skill, as we've seen. It could vary on the situation. And in fact, if we look at things that can affect the size of the friction force, we can look at two major things. One thing we look at is the nature of the surfaces contacting each other. So, my hand versus the bat. Those are the two surfaces contacting each other. I could change those. Okay, I could put on gloves. I can put powder on. I can put something on the bat. The book gives the example, and I don't know enough about cross-country skiing, but the book gives the example of the different parts of the cross-country ski. In the middle, you need more, I don't know which it was, more slipping, and toward the end, less. I have no idea. Don't know anything about that. But I do know that you can, with skiing, I think of all kinds of skiing, not just cross-country skiing, you can use various waxes to get the amount of slippage that you want. And that's what they're working on here, is friction, increasing or decreasing it. Okay, so you can look at the surfaces contact each other. In the case of the sled weight here, the sled will move better on grass than it does on gravel, for example, maybe, I think. So that can affect that. If we look at, again, looking at athletic shoes, these are the bottom of some basketball shoes. In basketball, there are times when you want some slippage and times when you don't. If you are trying to make a cut and trying to get open quickly, you don't want any slipping then. However, there's a point where you want to be able to pivot, and you need some slipping then. Otherwise, your foot won't move, and you'll get hurt. That's why with lots of basketball shoes, you can physically see differences in parts of the foot. And like right here, this part right here allows a little bit more slipping and allows that pivoting to happen. Whereas this is a little bit different type of surface. And on some basketball shoes, you look at them, you can't see the difference, but the difference is there nonetheless. Okay, again, a very practical example of how we use that. Another thing that affects the amount of friction has to do with the size of the force holding the surfaces together. Size of the force holding the surfaces together. Normal force. Here we have right here. Vertical ground reaction force is acting as a normal force here. Normal force acts perpendicular to the two surfaces, the ground right here, in this case, and the sled. And for those of you who don't know, this is a football sled, where they use in football practices. This normal force look, this is perpendicular to the ground and the sled. Now, things that can affect your normal force. Weight is a big one. So if you want more friction, let's say you have, and some of you who have played football, maybe you've had this experience where you've been working on the weight, the sled weight. Coach says, oh, you're pushing that too easy. In other words, the propelling force is much greater than the friction force. And he or she wants to increase the friction force for you. Well, what they do, they might stand on the weight, they might put weight on there, and that makes it harder to push. Why? Because there's more normal force. That increase of weight works up by using and increasing the normal force there. And so it makes it harder to push the weight. So decreasing normal force decreases friction. Increasing normal force increases friction. And really a lot of what has to do with normal force has to do with the weight or the mass of the object. Because we're not going to change the ground. I mean, we might change the surface of the ground, but that gets to this. But we're not changing the ground weight itself. So that's not going to change. So we change the other weight of the other object. Okay, other things having to do with friction and performance. There is this concept called the coefficient of friction. This is the ratio of friction force to normal force. And really that's just talking more about what we just talked about. Essentially what you need to know is the greater the coefficient of friction, the greater the normal force. So if you want to increase friction, you want to increase the normal force. If you want to decrease friction, you want to decrease the normal force. And that's just what we just talked about. Really, coefficient of friction, you don't need to know that term as much as just know what I just said. To increase friction, you increase normal force. To decrease friction, you decrease normal force. Now, ways that can be done. And we'll think in terms of tires. And tires are used in cycling, race car driving. Any other sports? Maybe about it. Okay, so things that can affect friction. One has to do with the thickness of the tires. So, tire like this width versus a tire this width versus a tire this width. Which one's going to have more friction? The wider tires. Okay, thinner tires, less friction. Wider tires, more friction. Why? Surface area on the ground. We just talked about nature of the surface affecting friction. In this case, it's the amount of surface area. So, tire thickness is one. Inflation pressure. How does inflation pressure affect friction? If I have a tire and I increase the air pressure in it, what's going to happen to my friction? It'll decrease. Okay, so the more air pressure you have, the less friction. Why again? Because you're going to have less of the tire in contact with the ground. When you decrease, how many of you have ever decreased pressure in your tire if you're traveling on icy roads? I've done it. because more contact with the ground. There's more friction. Okay? So less pressure in the tire means a flatter tire, so it looks like a thicker tire, essentially. Okay? What about wheel diameter? So right here. Or over here. So, there's a lopsided tire. Okay, here's the line through the middle is the diameter. Which tire is going to have more friction? Smaller one? Yes. Why? Okay, so your bigger tire, the bigger the diameter of a tire, the more contact area, again, everything has to do contact with the ground. The more contact you're going to have with the ground. And so that's going to have more friction. Okay? So that is wheel diameter. And then just the surface of the tire. What type of tire is it? What's the surface of the tire as well as the surface of the ground? What type of surface of the ground? Again, going back to this, that's those things right there. So a surface that is like rocky, kind of gravelly and stuff, with that kind of surface versus an asphalt surface, with a rocky surface, you're going to have more of the tire in contact with the ground again. Versus with a smooth surface, you're going to have less in contact with the ground. Okay. All right, so that's friction force. Have a quick review, discussion about friction force. Then we have something called fluid force. Now, what you need to write way at the top here, somewhere, is fluid force is not just water. We're talking about water and air. If you think just in terms of water, you're going to lose half of what we're talking about. So, fluid force are the forces placed on an object, and that should be singular, one object, on an object as it moves through the air. And that, moves through the fluid, and that fluid could be air or water. I mean, just simply me walking from here to that door, I am walking through a fluid, an air fluid, and there is a force being put on me as I do so. And that force is with the air. Now, the amount of fluid force, the type of fluid force is affected by several things. One has to do with the fluid itself. So the air fluid, the water fluid, those things affect the force that is placed on the object. One of those things is density. And density has to do with distribution of mass through a volume of space. Think of it this way. The number of molecules in a given amount of space. Okay? The number of molecules in a given amount of space. So, if you were to go over to the co-rec and go over to the competition pool and for some reason it's been emptied, and you decide you're going to run up and back and get a workout running up and back in the pool. Which is going to be easier, to run up and back in the pool when there's water in it or when there's not water? Well, yeah, not water. I mean, that makes sense. Why, though, is because water is more dense than air. Okay, has to do with density. The number of molecules in a given space. There are a lot more molecules of water in a given space than there are of air. Viscosity has to do with the fluid's resistance to flow. I like the example that the book gave of the orange juice. Viscosity is very affected by temperature. So in the case of the orange juice, you take a can of orange juice from your freezer, it has a high viscosity level, harder to move through. It would produce more fluid force. Then, after an hour, you let it sit out for an hour, and now it has less viscosity because of the warmer temperature, it melted that. Now it has less viscosity than it did when it was frozen. It'd be easier to move through that. Provides less resistance to you. One of the best examples of density of higher temperatures tend to have fluids that provide, higher temperatures provide less resistance than lower temperatures. So like in a pool, if you are swimming in a colder temperature pool versus a warmer one, your resistance is going to be greater in the colder one than the warmer one. Now, does that mean, especially those of you who are swimmers, does that mean you want to swim in a really, really hot pool? No. And why would that be? Yeah, there's a point where it gets too hot and you can't dissipate your own body heat, so then it's counterproductive. Okay? And that's why the competition pool you see over there is cooler than the recreation pool, because with the competition pool, people are working out. They're actually sweating or releasing body heat, and so you need a cooler temperature. Gets too cold though, then you increase the viscosity. This video helps to demonstrate what can happen when you are performing in a situation where air is less dense. The 1968 Olympics were held in Mexico City. Mexico City is at altitude. And there were many world records, especially in track and field, broken at the 1968 Olympics. And one in particular was just outstanding. This is a video of Bob Beamon, who won the long jump in the 1968 Olympics. Picture this. Most world records are broken in track and field by what? A little bit. 1/100th of a second, maybe 1/10 of a second. In things like this where we're measuring distance, like the long jump, maybe 1 inch, maybe 2 inch. He broke the world record, and part of it had to do with the less dense air in Mexico City. He broke it by 20 plus inches, over a foot, close to 2 feet. He broke the world record in the long jump. And so we're going to watch what that looked like. Particularly his reaction, which is pretty cool.
A record was set in Mexico City in 1968 that would endure for over 2 decades, one which those who witnessed it thought would not be broken until the next millennium. It became known as the leap of the century. Bob Beeman's first attempt in the long jump was beyond belief. In the space of 6 short seconds, Beeman had leapt so far that even for a field including defending champion Lynn Davis and American world record holder Ralph Boston, the contest was effectively over. The jump was beyond the limit of the measuring equipment.
They couldn't even measure it at first because they didn't have a tape long enough.
I thought, well, why is it taking so long? It's been 5, it's been 10 minutes. Then, about 15 minutes into the waiting period, they called in to bring in a manual tape. So they measured from the manual. I said, well, I probably jumped maybe 27:10. Maybe I broke the record maybe by a couple of inches. And then my teammate, Ralph Boston, mentioned to me, he said, look, the jump is wrong.
When the mark of 8 meters 90 appeared on the scoreboard, Beeman, used to non-metric measurement, still didn't know exactly how far he jumped. When he was told that his leap had taken him 29 feet, 2.5 inches, 21 3/4 inches further than had ever been jumped before, Beeman could not believe it himself. When he finally came to realize the enormity of his achievement, his legs gave way under him. He suffered what was later described as a cataplectic seizure, brought on by the sheer emotional energy in his body. Beeman's gold was a foregone conclusion. No one even came near to the previous world record. For many, Beeman's astonishing jump will always be the greatest of all the records achieved in the Olympic Games.
And obviously, I mean, he had to have the skill in order to do that. It wasn't just the density of the air, but I mean, that did have something to do with it. That's why when teams go to Denver, they tend to hit more home runs there than they do in other places. The air is less dense there. Okay? So those are some fluid factors. Those are things you can't necessarily control. What you can control are object factors, and you might be the object. As in this case, when we watch Beeman with his long jump, he was the object. And these things are part of what's you're gonna see continuing to come back and forth to us many times in the next few slides. One thing you can change is the cross-sectional area. Your book describes things like somebody jumping out of a plane. When they're just free falling, just jumping out without their parachute open, they don't have very much cross-sectional area. So they're traveling very quickly. There's not much resistance there. But obviously when you're jumping out of that plane, at some point you want to, and probably quite quickly, you want to decrease your or hit your parachute button, and that way your parachute greatly increases your cross-sectional area, which slows you down. It's providing more resistance. It's helping to provide more resistance. You see downhill skiers. When they're going downhill, you see speed skaters. They will try to, they're not going downhill straight up, they get into a crouched position. They're trying to decrease their cross-sectional area so that they can go faster. They're trying to decrease the resistance. The nature of the surface, smooth versus rough. Swimmers do this all the time. They might shave parts of their body. Try to make it as smooth as possible so there's as less resistance as possible. Wearing swim caps, wearing skin-tight swimming gear as well. You know, runners do the same thing. Used to wear looser clothing, now it's tighter fitting clothing. So they're trying to decrease the resistance that their body provides as they travel through the fluid of air, or water in the case of swimmers. Velocity. Velocity of the fluid over the body. That provides a resistance. Okay, so it's the speed of the fluid over the body. So, here we have a soccer ball. Over here, soccer ball A. This is a ball that's traveling through the air when there is no wind. The velocity of the ball is the velocity that it's traveling. Okay? Over here. Over here. Here we have a ball that is kicked against a wind. So here the ball is traveling this direction, and the wind is hitting against it. And so notice how the arrow here is smaller. Your ball velocity ends up being less. See how big the arrow is there, the relative velocity? Here's the relative velocity there, it's less. So your ball won't travel as fast. Here, we have a tailwind. So you kick a ball, and it's going with the wind. You see what happened to the relative ball velocity. It is much greater than when there's no wind, and especially when it's against the wind. Okay? So there is less resistance here, is what we're saying, and so less friction than you have here or here. And here you have the most friction. Now, this right here helps to explain why in track and field, what is the limit? Is it 2 meters per second? 2 miles per hour? I forget what it is. Is it 2 meters per second? You cannot, in track and field, you cannot have a tailwind greater than 2 meters per second, like when you're running the 100 or when you're doing the long jump, because in that case, what they're saying is that your tailwind, there's much less resistance there, and so you're getting essentially an unfair assistance in your performance. And so we can count a victory, but we can't count records in those cases. Okay? People who are doing, especially like long jump and maybe the javelin, that sort of thing, they'll try to time their performances sometimes so that they get very little tailwind. Because you don't want that if you have a good performance. Okay? All right. We will start here next time. Also, Dr. Least last I heard, Dr. Ambiki will be here next time as well.